A cold fog covered the city, spreading through the streets like a harbinger of trouble to come. I was just about to call it a day when the office buzzed. Captain Reed spoke quickly, his voice tense. "Maxfer, get over here right away. Homicide. They found a body downtown. And what's strange is we have a witness, but his story is confusing." I rushed to the scene. It was a third-floor apartment in an old brick building. The stairs creaked under my feet, the walls were covered with peeling wallpaper, and the smell of dampness made me breathe through my mouth. In the living room, I saw a body. A man in his 40s was lying face down on the floor. Judging from his posture, death had come to him suddenly. "Who's our witness?" I asked Reed, looking around the room. The captain pointed to a man standing in the corner. He looked strange, thin, with deep-set eyes and nervous hand movements. His name was Thomas Raines. He claimed he was walking by the house, heard a noise, went inside and came across a dead body. "You just walked in?" I asked him as I approached him. The door was ajar. "I thought maybe someone needed help," he answered, his voice shaking. Something about the way he spoke made me wary. Maybe it was the slight uncertainty in his voice, or the way he avoided making eye contact. "Did you hear anything else?" "Screams, footsteps." I continued. Thomas shook his head negatively. His answers were brief, but too measured. Something wasn't adding up here. I noticed Reed pick up a small gold pendant from the floor. He handed it to me. It was engraved on the back with the initials DW. "Thomas, have you seen this pendant?" I asked, showing him the find. "No," he answered quickly, too quickly. My gut told me that Raines was obviously hiding something. I started looking around the apartment. It looked surprisingly neat for a crime scene, no signs of struggle, everything in its place. But upon closer inspection, I noticed something odd. On the desk was an unfinished note. Its last words were cut off by the phrase, "I can't go on." The text was interrupted, as if someone had prevented the victim from finishing the thought. There were shoe prints on the carpet near the door. They led in, but not out. That fact was immediately apparent. Someone had entered, but didn't seem to leave. There was a glass of unfinished wine on the kitchen counter. I leaned over to sniff and caught the faint odor of chemistry. Poison, perhaps? Thomas stood to the side, watching my actions. I noticed him tense up as I approached the bedroom door. It was closed, and there were smudged fingerprints on the knob. "Did you come in here?" I asked. "No, I found him already dead," he answered, his voice sounding almost pleading. I turned the knob and opened the door. It was dark inside. The only source of light was the flashlight in my hands. On the floor, I noticed a tiny scrap of cloth. It didn't match the victim's clothes. Reed came into the room after me. "What do you think?" he asked, looking at me. "I think there were more people here than just Thomas and the victim," I said. "We brought Thomas to the station for questioning. His story sounded logical, but the details didn't add up." "Why did you decide to go inside in the first place?" I asked, sitting across from him in the dimly lit room. "I heard a noise. Like someone moaning," he answered, rubbing his hands together. "Earlier you said you came in through the ajar door. So which one of those is true?" Thomas fell silent, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Maybe I got it wrong. It was stress." "Stress?" "For someone who just happened to be around, you remember too much," I parried. I laid out the gold pendant with the initials in front of him. "You didn't see him at the crime scene, did you?" "No, Thomas answered quietly, avoiding my gaze. I wonder. What would you say if I told you that the fingerprints on the pendant matched yours? I asked, watching his reaction. He turned pale, and his hands began to tremble. Thomas was obviously hiding something. But what? I swear I didn't kill anyone, he exclaimed, clenching his fists. We'll see about that, I said, sensing that the truth was about to come to the surface. Back at the apartment, I continued to look for details that might shed some light on what was going on. Every crime scene tells its own story if you know how to hear it. The first thing I did was re-examine the carpet by the door. The footprints on it struck me as odd. They belonged to different people. I photographed them and sent them to forensics. In the kitchen, in addition to the wine glass, I found a faint smudge on the sink. It could have been anything, but the color of the deposit hinted at a chemical. It probably got there when someone washed their hands. The key discovery was the stains on the bedroom doorknob. Analysis showed they were traces of sweat and hand cream particles. Nothing unusual at first glance, but if Thomas really hadn't gone into that room, whose footprints were they? I made my way to the desk, where the note I'd written was lying unfinished. Rereading it, I noticed that the handwriting became more and more uneven toward the end. Someone had obviously written it under stress. What do you think? Captain Reed asked, appearing behind me. I think this isn't just a murder. There's a game here. A game they're trying to draw us into, I replied, handing him the note. What's the game? We'll see what the trace analysis says. And I want to know who else was in this apartment the day before the murder, I added. Thomas was looking more and more suspicious, but something told me he was only part of a bigger picture. While the lab was testing the evidence, I decided to learn more about the victim. The man found dead was a lawyer with decades of experience. Harry Watson, 39 years old, had repeatedly won cases that seemed hopeless. But that success led him to make enemies. In the office where Watson worked, I met his secretary, a woman in her 50s with a watchful eye. Harry was a good man, she said, adjusting her glasses. But he knew it would end someday. Why do you feel that way? I asked. She was silent for a moment, then added. He often receives threats. The last one came 2 weeks ago. Someone had left it on his desk. I asked to see the letter. It was written on cheap paper and the words were typed. You'll regret what you did, it said. Did Harry say anything about it? I continued. No. He seemed worried, but refused to discuss anything, the woman replied, frowning. This detail became important to me. I sensed that the threat might have been related to his recent dealings. Had he had conflicts with clients? I asked one last time. The secretary nodded. Yes, one of them was particularly persistent. His name was Edward Hall. I wrote down the name and thanked her. Now I had another person to look up to. By the time I got back to the station, the test results were in. The footprints on the carpet and on the doorknob belonged to different people. One of the samples matched Thomas's prints and the other matched an unknown profile. We called Thomas back in for questioning. This time his demeanor changed. He was even more tense, but tried to keep a mask of calm. Thomas, I have a few questions, I began, placing the photos of the footprints in front of him. You claimed you didn't touch the bedroom door. But then why were your fingerprints on the knob? His face turned pale and his hands clenched into fists. Maybe I accidentally touched it while I was walking by, he muttered. Accidentally? What about the second footprint? You said there was no one else, I continued, watching his reaction closely. I don't know, he replied, clearly losing his composure. "Thomas," I leaned closer, "you're lying. You're hiding something, and it's only making things worse for you." He was silent, but his trembling gave everything away. I knew the truth was close, and the next step was going to reveal everything. The key clues were finally starting to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. The second print found at the crime scene belonged to an unknown person. Thomas obviously knew something, but he was keeping it a secret. I decided to do things differently. Instead of applying direct pressure, I decided to go through his entourage. Soon I managed to reach a woman who had recently been seen with Thomas, his neighbor, Sarah Miller. Sarah looked terrified when I arrived at her apartment. Her apartment was furnished modestly but neatly. There was a cup of unfinished coffee on the table. "Ms. Miller," I began, trying to speak calmly, "I need to know what you know about Thomas." She looked at me confused. "Thomas is a good man. We don't talk much, but I don't believe he could be involved in anything illegal." "Are you sure you haven't noticed anything unusual about him lately?" I asked. She hesitated. Then, apparently making up her mind, she added, "He's been nervous lately. I heard him talking on the phone at night. He sounded agitated." "Did you hear what it was about?" Sarah nodded. "He said something about her, about some kind of meeting. I don't know the details, but he was obviously afraid." This information added a new intrigue. Who is her? Was this woman connected to the murder? Back at the station, I realized it was time to call Thomas back in for another talk. His story was getting more and more convoluted, but I knew the truth was out there. When Thomas was brought into the interrogation room, he looked tired. His eyes darted around nervously, as if he were searching for a way out of a situation that was increasingly tightening its rings around him. "Thomas, enough games," I began firmly. "You were talking to someone before the murder. Who was that woman?" His face turned pale, and then he stood up abruptly. "You can't prove anything," he shouted. "Maybe," I nodded, "but we know about your phone calls. We know you were in the victim's apartment, and we know someone else was there. If you don't tell us who, it's only going to make things worse for you." After a few minutes of silence, he finally broke down. "Okay," he muttered, lowering his head. "It was Jessica. She was there." "Who's Jessica?" I asked, feeling like I'd finally found a clue. She's Harry's ex-wife," he answered. "They broke up on a bad note, but she kept following him. That night she said she wanted to end it all." That confession came as a real shock. If Jessica really was in the apartment, it changed everything. Thomas may not have been at fault, but his silence made him complicit. Episode 9, Denouement. We tracked Jessica to a small house on the outskirts of town. When I went inside, she was already waiting for us. There was a cup of tea on the table in front of her and her gaze was completely calm. "I knew you'd come," she said, nodding to a vacant chair. "So you admit you were there that night?" I asked, wasting no time. She nodded. "Yes, I was there. But I didn't kill him." "Then why were you in hiding?" I continued. Her voice became firmer. "Because I knew no one would believe me. Harry brought this on himself. He played with people, ruined lives. I went to talk to him that night, but he was already dead when I walked in." Her words sounded convincing, but something in her demeanor was unsettling. I pulled up the crime scene photo and showed her. "If you're innocent, how do you explain your fingerprints being found on the glass?" Her face twitched. She tried to say something, but fell silent. "Jessica," I added more gently, the truth will come out anyway. It's better if you tell it yourself. After a long silence, she finally spoke. Harry knew he was going to be killed. He even warned me to stay away. But I didn't listen. Who did it? I asked, feeling like we were getting to the most important part. Her eyes filled with tears. It was Thomas. In that moment, all the pieces of the puzzle came together. Thomas used Jessica as a cover, knowing that her connection to Harry would make her the prime suspect. He had the perfect plan, but his nerves and desperation gave him away. The case was closed, but I knew this story would stay with me for a long time. Everyone in the game had lost something important, and only the truth brought a bitter, albeit bitter, relief. Support me by subscribing to the channel if you want more detective stories. I'm doing this for you, and your support inspires me. Let me know what you think of the video in the comments. Your opinion is really important.